What leads someone to believe they have the right to decide another person's fate? Why do some refuse to accept rejection? West Palm Beach, Florida. Valentine's Day, 2011. A day meant for love, for promises, for the warmth of companionship. Instead, it became the night when a relationship ended in the worst way imaginable. The man with the gun was Gibson Paul. The woman in the car was his ex-girlfriend. Their love story was over, but he refused to accept it. Tomicka had made her choice. She wanted to move on. She had tried to create distance, tried to close the door on a past she no longer wished to be part of. It was supposed to be that simple. But for some, letting go is never an option. Violence is often about control. When control slips away, some will go to any lengths to take it back. Tomicka Peterson was not the first, nor would she be the last, to pay the price for walking away. This is the story of a crime that never should have happened, a trial that sought justice, and a man who would spend the rest of his life behind bars. This is the story of what happens when love turns into something unrecognizable. Leave a comment below. Have you or someone you know ever experienced the fear of a partner who refused to let go? What do you think should be done to prevent cases like this? Let's talk about the people involved, the choices that led here, and the tragic moment that ended a life forever. Tomicka Peterson was more than the way her life ended. She was a daughter, a friend, a mother. She had dreams, like anyone else. A future she was working toward. Those who knew her spoke of a woman who cared deeply, who loved fiercely, who wanted the best for herself and the people around her. She was building a life. Balancing responsibilities. Figuring things out, one day at a time. She had a job, a routine, a way of moving through the world that made sense to her. She had goals, plans for where she wanted to be in the years ahead. Before we continue, drop a comment below, let us know where you are tuning in from and the time. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel. Then there was Gibson Paul. A man with a different past, a different way of seeing the world. His life had followed a path that led him in and out of trouble. A history marked by choices that brought consequences. A record that told its own story before he ever met Tomicka. Their relationship started like many do. A connection, a shared understanding, the belief that they had something worth holding on to. In the beginning, there were good moments. Laughter. Promises. The idea that they could build a future together. But time has a way of revealing things. Some relationships grow. Others begin to show cracks. What started as affection shifted into something else. Small things turned into arguments. Disagreements became harder to ignore. The signs were there, the kind that close friends might notice, the kind that a person deep in love might brush aside. Tomicka saw it. She felt it. And eventually, she made a choice. She walked away. Some people accept the end of a relationship. They move on. They heal. They find a new beginning. But not everyone can let go. For Gibson Paul, the breakup was not just the loss of a partner, it was a loss of control. And for a man like him, that was something he could not accept. A decision had been made. One that would change everything. What happens when someone refuses to take no for an answer? When the idea of letting go is not an option? Tomicka Peterson was about to find out. When Tomicka told Gibson Paul it was over, she meant it. She didn't look back. She cut off contact. She focused on her own life. But he refused to let go. At first, it was small things. Running into him in places she frequented. Seeing his car parked near her home. A text, then another. The messages shifted from pleading to anger. When she ignored them, he found new ways to get her attention. One of her friends later recalled a conversation. Tomicka had mentioned feeling uneasy, like she was being watched. She tried to shake it off, to convince herself that it was just her mind playing tricks. Then came the threats. He didn't say them outright, but they were there, hidden between words meant to sound harmless. Comments about how she would regret leaving. How no one else would ever love her like he did. How some things couldn't be undone. She stopped going places alone. She changed routines. But no matter what she did, he found a way to remind her he was still there. Then came February 14, 2011. A day meant for love. A day that, for her, would end in the worst way possible. That morning, Tomicka went about her routine. She had plans later that day. She wanted to spend time with people who cared about her. She wasn't thinking about him, but he was thinking about her. As she moved through her day, he was never far behind. By the time the sun dipped below, Tomicka found herself in a car with 2 friends and a young child. They were parked, talking, unaware that someone was approaching. Then, everything changed. A gunshot rang out. Glass shattered. Screams filled the air. The impact was immediate. Tomicka slumped forward, her body still, her breathing gone. The people inside the car were frozen in shock. A child's voice broke through the chaos, too young to understand what had just happened. Outside, he stood there for a moment, gun in hand, before vanishing into the night. Sirens blared in the distance. Help arrived too late. She was gone. Her story didn't end there. The investigation, the trial, the justice that followed, those would come next. But in that moment, all that remained was a car filled with shattered glass and the silence of a life cut short. The night had been quiet. The streets of West Palm Beach carried the usual sounds. Cars passing, conversations drifting through the air, the distant hum of music from nearby houses. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, a shot. For a brief moment, there was stillness. Then, panic. Inside the car, fear gripped those who had just witnessed something they could never forget. A life had been taken in front of them. A friend. A mother. A woman who had only wanted to move on. People nearby turned their heads toward the sound, searching for the source. A few rushed forward, trying to understand what had just happened. Others stayed back, frozen, afraid of what they might see. The gunman had already disappeared. The streetlights cast a glow on the shattered glass. The echoes of the shot still lingered in the air. Tomicka Peterson did not move. She was in the driver's seat, her body slumped forward. The wound was fatal. There was no time for last words. No chance to call for help. The moment the bullet struck, everything was over. The people inside the car were in shock. One of them, eyes wide, hands shaking, reached for a phone and dialed. The voice on the other end answered, asking for details. The words came out broken, frantic. Someone's been shot. Within minutes, red and blue lights flooded the street. Sirens wailed as officers pulled up, stepping out of their vehicles with urgency. Their radios crackled as they relayed what little information they had. A small crowd had gathered nearby, whispering, watching. Some had heard the gunshot but hadn't seen what happened. Others had been close enough to understand the horror of it all. Paramedics moved quickly, but there was nothing they could do. She was already gone. One officer surveyed the vehicle. The driver's side window had been shattered. Glass covered the pavement. The bullet had done its damage, leaving no room for survival. The people inside the car, 2 friends and a child, were shaken, barely able to speak. Detectives arrived soon after. The area was sealed off. Yellow tape stretched across the street. Flashing lights reflected off buildings and cars. Evidence markers were placed carefully on the ground. Witnesses were pulled aside, asked to recount what they had seen. One of Tomicka's friends, voice unsteady, described the moment they saw him. How he had appeared suddenly. How the gun had been raised without hesitation. How it had all happened in an instant. The child, too young to fully understand, clung to one of the adults, eyes darting around in confusion. Somewhere in the distance, the gunman was on the run. News of the shooting spread fast. The name Tomicka Peterson was spoken in hushed conversations. Friends and family were notified. The weight of what had happened began to settle in. Local news stations arrived, cameras capturing the flashing lights, the tape blocking off the scene, the officers speaking in low tones. Reporters stood in front of the scene, microphones in hand, delivering the first details to the public. Social media filled with shock and sadness. People who knew her posted pictures, memories, messages of grief. Others, who had never met her, reacted to the headlines, sharing their thoughts on yet another life lost to violence. The investigation had only just begun. The pieces were still being put together. But one thing was certain, this was no accident. Someone had wanted her dead. And that someone was still out there. A woman was gone. A child had witnessed something no child should ever see. Two friends sat frozen in disbelief, their minds trying to make sense of what had just happened. But somewhere beyond the flashing lights and the yellow tape, he was out there. A man who had made a choice. A man who had pulled the trigger and walked away. The search for him had begun. Law enforcement wasted no time. The crime scene was locked down, every detail documented. Officers scanned the area, looking for security cameras, anything that could have caught what had happened. Detectives questioned the people inside the car. Every word mattered. Every detail could help build the case. One of the friends described the way he had approached, how there had been no hesitation, no words exchanged. Just the gun. Just the shot. Just the sound of breaking glass and the sight of Tomicka no longer moving. The child had seen it too. Too young to explain, too young to understand, but old enough to remember. Police turned to nearby residents. Did anyone see a man running? Did anyone hear a car speeding away? The description of him spread fast. They needed to find him before he disappeared for good. Forensic teams worked through the night. The shattered glass was collected. The bullet casing was bagged. The path of the shot was analyzed. Everything pointed to a deliberate act. He had meant for this to happen. He had come with a purpose. Tomicka's phone was examined. The messages told their own story. The calls. The threats. The way he had refused to let go. There was no question about who had done this. Now, it was only a matter of bringing him in. The search intensified. Officers checked places he was known to visit. They spoke to people who had been close to him. Some claimed they had no idea where he was. Others hesitated before answering, as if they knew but were afraid to say. Then, a break. A tip came in. Someone had seen him. Someone knew where he was hiding. Officers moved fast. The location was surrounded. There was no way out. For a few moments, there was silence. Then, the sound of a door opening. He stepped out, hands raised. There was no fight, no struggle, no last attempt to escape. He knew it was over. Cuffs were placed on his wrists. His rights were read. He was taken away, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. At the station, he was questioned. He didn't deny knowing her. He didn't deny being there. But when asked why, when asked what had driven him to do it, his answers were short. Excuses. Justifications. Blame placed anywhere but on himself. But the evidence spoke louder than his words. Tomicka had tried to leave. He had refused to let her go. And now, there was no undoing what had been done. The waiting had begun. For Tomicka's family, the worst had already happened. There was no bringing her back. No undoing the moment that had stolen her life. But justice had to come. The man responsible had been caught. Now, the system would decide what would happen next. A courtroom. A jury. A verdict. The case moved forward. Prosecutors were prepared. They had the evidence. They had witnesses. They had the messages that told the story before the crime even happened. Tomicka had walked away from him. He had refused to accept it. And on Valentine's Day, he had made sure she never walked away again. The courtroom was packed. Family members sat together, their faces heavy with grief. Reporters took notes, cameras rolling outside. People who had never even met her followed the case, waiting to hear what would happen next. The prosecution laid it all out. They presented the text messages. The ones where he had threatened her. The ones where his words dripped with anger, warning her that leaving him would have consequences. They played the 911 call. The frantic voice. The panic. The screams in the background. They called Tomicka's friends to the stand. The ones who had been in the car. The ones who had seen him raise the gun, had seen him pull the trigger without hesitation. A forensic expert explained the bullet's path. The way it struck her. The way there had been no chance to survive. Everything pointed to one truth. This was not a crime of passion. This was a decision. A choice he had made long before he ever lifted that gun. The defense had their turn. They painted a different picture. They spoke of emotions, of heartbreak. They tried to shift the blame. But the facts did not change. A man had taken a gun, walked up to her car, fired once, walked away. That was all that mattered. Then, the jury. They listened. They watched. They took in every word. And when it was time, they left the courtroom to decide his fate. Hours passed. The waiting was unbearable. But then, the doors opened. The jury returned. Everyone sat still. No one moved. The verdict was read. Guilty. The sentencing came soon after. The judge did not hesitate. The law was clear. Life in prison. No chance for freedom. No chance to do this to anyone else. For Tomicka's loved ones, it was justice. But it was not peaceful. Because no sentence could bring her back. The man who took her life would spend the rest of his years behind bars. But she was still gone. If you enjoy this type of content, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to the channel, like, and share this video. Also, don't forget to put on your notification bell so you be the first to be notified whenever we post a new video. A courtroom had made its decision. A sentence had been handed down. The man responsible would never walk free again. But the truth remained. None of it changed what had already happened. A mother would never see her child grow up. A daughter would never call her family again. A friend, a coworker, a loved one, gone. And for what? Control. Possession. The belief that if she wasn't his, she couldn't be anyone's. It was a story told too many times, with endings that never changed. This case ended in tragedy. But the warning signs had been there long before that night. The threats. The obsession. The refusal to let go. Too often, these moments are brushed aside. Words are dismissed as empty. Promises of harm are ignored until it's too late. But words lead to actions. And actions destroy lives. Tomicka did what so many others have done. She tried to leave. She wanted to move forward. She wanted peace. But he made sure she never got the chance. The law responded. A guilty verdict. A life sentence. A man locked away, unable to hurt anyone else. But what does justice mean when a life is already lost? When a family has to visit a grave instead of a home? When a child has to grow up with memories instead of a mother? Legal consequences matter. But they come after the fact. The real fight is stopping it before it gets this far. So now the question is, how do we prevent this from happening again? How do we recognize the signs before another life is taken? How do we make sure that when someone says they are afraid, they are heard? If you or someone you know is in a situation like this, there is help. There are people who will listen. There are ways out. But time is everything. Waiting is a risk no one can afford. What do you think? How can society do more to stop violence like this before it happens? Let us know in the comments. Your voice matters.